Well, thank you very much for that. I want to talk this afternoon a little bit about some of the experiences that we've had in Mid-Kent. I've titled this slide at the presentation, Myths, Realities and a Few Things We've Learned, and hopefully we'll see why as we go through. Firstly, just by way of a few points of overview, I'm just going to explain a little bit about the context of why the four authorities came together and some of the issues around that. A few of the practical tips and a few of the points that have worked for us. This may not work and may not apply in all groups of authorities, but it's some of the experiences that we've had and we've learnt from. One of the things that we've done is we've taken a very evidence-based approach to the way in which we deliver shared services. All of the design of the shared service has been based on some well-researched and some well-assessed models. So we've, in the process of doing that, uncovered a few areas of general conventional wisdom which we would support and a few things which we think on reflection may be generally accepted wisdom but certainly in our experience haven't necessarily been proved by the evidence. Firstly, by way of background, the four authorities are Ashford, Swale, Maidstone, Tunbridge Wells. As a group of authorities, there's some information around them there. If you took any four authorities at random in the country, you'd probably come up with something which had very similar characteristics to us. There's nothing remarkable or different or special about the group of authorities. We're slightly larger than average. Other than that, we're totally unremarkable. The only thing I think which is slightly different about the way we've approached it than compared with some other models is that our approach has been the best way to start is to start. So the initial conception of the MKIT partnership emerged from a boozy lunch of the leaders and chief execs one Friday afternoon, for which they decided it would be a jolly good idea to share some services, and that's really how it actually came about. And we started pretty much the next week in designing our first of our shared services. We did spend very, very little time on the governance, the structure, the arrangements, the detail, and it's very much a case of we'll cross those bridges when we come to them. It might have been right, it might have been wrong, but we were designing shared services really from day one. Few points. I'll come back to these all in more detail. But from what we've learnt, we believe that larger teams are inherently more efficient, and we can show that using some mathematical approaches and also some experience. One of the things about shared services for me is that it lets people do what they do best more of the time. We've looked at a number of examples, and we found that we have specialists, experts who are particularly good at what they do. And the tragedy is, in a small district environment, they're only spending 40 or 50% of their time doing what they do really, really well. And the reason for that is there's simply not enough work in a small district for them to do what they do really, really well 100% of the time. So it's an instant argument that supports the concept of a shared service. We've also done a lot of analysis, which I'll talk about later on, around the different models, different operating models, whether that's in-house, out-house, devolved, central, horizontal, vertical, different configurations. And we've yet to find any evidence, any law of nature, which says one model is inherently better than a different variation. And the only exception to that is that shared services, from what we've seen, do tend to be cheaper than other operating models. And that's the only type of service, only configuration that we've found that applies. Some of the actual numbers that are involved, the services that we've looked at, not all of them have ended up in shared services, but we've found typically 15 to 20% efficiencies can be generated every time that we've looked at a configuration of a shared service. And I would actually say that those numbers are realistic numbers. They are net figures of the investment costs to deliver the shared service. They're not the gross savings. And I think in many cases we could probably have gone further. So there is potentially still more to come. It's not just about cost reduction for us. It's also about improving the environment for staff, and it's about improving the environment for customers as well. And for us, what we found is that the key aspect, the key thing to focus in on is listening very carefully to what customers are saying and staff are saying about the things that frustrate them in their daily delivery or experience of the services. And for us, that's been the key clue as to where to start in terms of improving the service. A few points about how. Our overriding philosophy in our approach is that if it's complicated, it's probably wrong. It may be that we're just not very smart at doing things as soon as they get complicated, and our brains aren't big enough to cope with it when it gets complicated. But in our experience, that does seem to apply. And it's not just us that say that. Scientists discovered this in the Middle Ages, that actually complexity is almost certainly, as a rule of thumb, likely to be wrong. And that applies to the way we design the services, and it applies to the way we review the approaches. A typical review structure for our model looks a little bit like this. Again, it's not particularly remarkable. We have a leaders and chief execs board. We have a directors level board that meets monthly. We have a project board for each particular review we're undertaking, and that comprises a review manager with a core group of review staff who are seconded into the programme, who have developed a set of skills and expertise. And for each review, we bring in the service managers and we bring in members of the teams of the services that we're reviewing to supplement that team. So we have a blend of consistency and subject specialism in each of the reviews. The only thing that's potentially interesting about that model is you'll notice there's very little role for external consultants in that. We have spent a grand princely sum of £3,000 on consultants in the entire 18 months that we've been operating. And what we do is we have an external critical friend, sometimes that we bring in for each review. Increasingly, I found myself adopting that role for other groups of authorities, but it's a way in which we've been able to deliver the programme internally and cost effectively. For that to work, what we found is that it's important to recognise the design of shared services as a profession in its own right. One of the advantages that an external consultant can bring is the credibility factor that says, you know, the more miles that you've travelled to give advice, the better the quality of the advice that you're going to give. With an internal team, you don't have the advantage of that. So it's important to recognise shared services and the design of shared services as a skill and a profession in its own right. And that seems to be a pattern which is emerging elsewhere. Encouragingly, there is now, for the first time, going to be a qualification, a postgraduate certificate qualification in shared service design, which is going to be through Canterbury University. And I think that's an important milestone in the development of this type of approach. And I think that's an interesting development. We know this, don't we? If you had a group of authorities that had the stuff on the left and a group of authorities that had in place the stuff on the right, and I was to ask you to put some money on which of the group of authorities would be further ahead in 18 months' time, I think most people would probably plump for the authorities that had the stuff on the left. But sometimes in the hurly-burly of designing a shared service and getting groups of authorities together, it's the stuff on the right that we tend to focus on. And I think, you know, we all know this as a reality, but sometimes we forget it as we're going through. Our approach is a fairly comprehensive approach. What we tend to do is to look not just at the traditional analysis of the processes that are operating in the authorities. We also look at a variety of other areas of it. We look at unit costs. We break down the costs into a fair amount of detail so that we can understand how much each of the processes is costing. We also overlay on that what the process is delivering in terms of customer satisfaction and some of the metrics about the way the process is operating, what we call the process performance measures. And when we put the composite picture of all those four things together and overlay one on top of the other, then we start to get some quite interesting insights into the way that the services are designed. Some examples of the sort of things we looked at in process performance terms is fairly straightforward measures. Often they're metrics that are involved in enable us to compare them. The only interesting one is the thing we call the unrequited demand measure, which effectively is a measure of how much of our time we're spending saying no to people. Often in our services, 10 to 20% of the requests for services, we look at the application from the individual and we say no, which is an astonishing waste of time for the individual that's applied for it, and it's also not very cost effective for us. An example might be the number of planning applications that we turn down or the benefit applications that we reject. If we can encourage people to self-select out of applying for the service in the first place through some good quality communications and some involvement in third sector partners, then it's an easy way of reducing our costs. Another aspect of the approach that we take is what we call the accumulation of marginal gains. Again, this isn't our idea. The British cycling team, which did so well at the Olympics last year, based their success on this exact principle. It turns out that Bradley Wiggins won the 4,000-metre event by 0.1 of a second. If you were to place your hands on the handlebar of a track cycling bike in that position or that position, the effect of that over the course of the race is more than 0.1 of a second. Similarly, having a wrinkle in your skin suit is worth more than that over the course of the race. So the motto is, if you want to win a gold medal at the Olympics, you've got to get every single detail right. The important point about those details is if you can get 10 of those details right, none of those details costs any money, but each of them individually is enough to make a significant difference. So there are opportunities in most of our services to get a 10% gain by getting 10 details right.